A few years ago, a behavioral psychologist decided to run an unusual social experiment. It was simple on the surface, almost deceptively so. Two men were selected. They were similar in age, similar in appearance, dressed almost identically, and placed in the same social environment, a relaxed evening gathering where people were mingling, talking, laughing, and meeting strangers. The men approached women throughout the event, starting conversations just like anyone else would. But there was one difference between them. One tiny difference that most people would never suspect could matter. Just two words. Two small words that one of the men used at the beginning of every conversation. The outcome of the experiment surprised even the researchers. One man struggled to keep conversations alive. Women answered his questions politely, but their attention faded quickly. Their bodies angled away. Their eyes wandered. Within minutes, the interaction was over. The other man experienced the opposite. Women leaned closer when he spoke. They laughed more easily. They asked him questions in return. Conversations lasted longer, flowed more naturally, and in many cases, the women seemed genuinely interested in continuing the interaction. Same environment, same looks, same opportunity. The difference was two words. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what those words are and, more importantly, the deep psychological mechanism that makes them so powerful. Once you understand the reason behind them, you'll start noticing this dynamic everywhere, in friendships, in business, in dating, and in everyday conversations. Stay with me, because this insight has the potential to completely reshape how you communicate with people. If you're new here, welcome. This channel focuses on one central idea: understanding the psychology behind human behavior, so you can navigate social interactions with greater awareness, confidence, and insight. Today we're exploring attraction, not the shallow kind, based on pickup lines or tricks, but the deeper psychological processes that make someone feel compelling, engaging, and memorable in conversation. And strangely enough, it all begins with two words. But before revealing them, it's important to understand why they work. Because knowing a technique without understanding the principle behind it is like having a tool without knowing how or when to use it. The real power lies in the psychology beneath the surface. To explain this, let me tell you about someone named Daniel. Daniel was 28 years old. He wasn't unattractive. He had a stable job, a solid group of friends, and a generally good life. On paper, everything about him seemed perfectly normal. Yet whenever he tried to talk to women he found interesting, things seemed to fall apart. He would walk up, smile politely, and begin the way most people do. "Hey, how's your night going?" Or perhaps, "So what do you do for work?" The women would respond kindly enough. They weren't rude. They answered his questions, gave polite smiles, maybe even laughed once or twice. But the interaction always faded quickly. Their attention drifted, and within moments they found a natural excuse to step away. Daniel couldn't understand what he was doing wrong. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't offensive. In fact, he was doing exactly what most advice columns suggested: ask questions, be polite, show interest. Yet nothing seemed to spark real connection. One evening, a close female friend finally gave him a piece of feedback that changed everything. She said, "When you talk to people, it feels like you're interviewing them." Daniel laughed at first, but she continued, "It's like you're going through a list of safe questions. Where are you from? What do you do? How's your night going? It doesn't feel like a conversation. It feels like a form you're filling out." That comment hit him harder than he expected. Because she was right. Daniel wasn't connecting with people. He was performing a conversation instead of actually having one. Everything shifted the moment he stopped trying to say the correct things and started speaking in a way that felt genuine and observant. And that shift revolved around two deceptively simple words. Before revealing them, we need to understand something fundamental about attraction. Most people assume attraction begins and ends with appearance. Physical attractiveness certainly plays a role in first impressions. Evolutionary psychology supports that idea. But the kind of attraction that lingers, the kind that makes someone think about you hours later, isn't primarily visual. It's emotional. Specifically, it's about how someone feels when they're around you. And this is where neuroscience becomes incredibly interesting. Researchers studying human interaction discovered a type of brain cell known as mirror neurons. These neurons activate not only when we perform an action ourselves, but also when we observe someone else performing it. In simple terms, our brains are constantly reflecting the emotional state of the people around us. If someone approaches a conversation feeling tense, anxious, and overly concerned about the outcome, that emotional state subtly transfers to the other person. Even if no one says it out loud, the nervous energy is felt. But the reverse is also true. If someone enters a conversation calm, attentive, and genuinely interested in the person in front of them, that emotional state spreads as well. The other person begins to feel more relaxed, more open, more comfortable. This is why certain individuals seem naturally charismatic. They aren't necessarily saying extraordinary things. What they are doing is creating an emotional atmosphere where the other person feels interesting, valued, and understood. And this brings us to the two words. Psychologist Carl Rogers, one of the most influential figures in humanistic psychology, built his entire career around a simple but profound insight. Human beings possess a deep, almost primal desire to feel understood. Not judged, not evaluated, simply understood. Rogers referred to this as empathic understanding, and his research showed that when people experience even brief moments of genuine understanding from another person, they feel an immediate sense of connection and trust. This effect doesn't only apply in therapy sessions, it appears in friendships, leadership, mentorship, and romantic attraction. The people who make others feel deeply understood often appear magnetic. So what are the two words? They are simply, you seem. At first glance, that might not sound impressive, but psychologically, those two words trigger several powerful mechanisms at once. First, they signal attention. When you begin a statement with you seem, you are communicating that you've been observing the other person. You're not just running through generic conversation scripts, you're actually paying attention to them specifically. In a world where everyone is distracted by phones, notifications, and their own thoughts, being truly noticed feels rare. Second, the phrase invites curiosity, rather than making assumptions. There's a big difference between saying you are adventurous and saying you seem like someone who enjoys adventure. The first sounds like a declaration. The second sounds like an observation open to exploration. It invites the other person to confirm, deny, or expand upon it. And that invitation creates engagement. Third, it activates something psychologists call self-disclosure. Studies from Harvard researchers have shown that talking about ourselves activates the brain's reward system in ways similar to receiving money or eating enjoyable food. Humans are wired to enjoy sharing their stories, experiences, and identities. When someone says, "You seem like the kind of person who doesn't follow the usual path," the mind instantly wants to respond. Why do they think that? Are they right? Should I explain? The conversation becomes emotionally active rather than mechanically polite. But there is a crucial detail most people overlook. The phrase only works when it's followed by a thoughtful, specific observation. Generic compliments don't create the same effect. Saying "you seem really pretty" doesn't spark curiosity, it's something people hear constantly. Instead, consider statements like, "You seem like someone who notices details most people miss," Or you seem like the type of person who has more interesting stories than you're letting on. Or even you seem like someone who turns stressful situations into something funny later. Do you notice the difference? You're not simply praising appearance. You're reflecting a possible aspect of their personality, energy, or experience. That reflection feels personal and intriguing. This exact realization changed everything for Daniel. At his next social gathering, instead of opening with the usual small talk questions, he approached someone with a simple observation. He smiled and said, "You seem like you're observing everything happening in this room, rather than getting caught up in it." The woman laughed immediately. Her expression lit up, and she responded by explaining that she actually loved watching people at events because she found human behavior fascinating. That single observation opened a conversation that lasted nearly 20 minutes. Daniel barely asked any standard questions. Instead, he listened and reflected back what he noticed. At one point he said, "You seem like someone who turns uncomfortable situations into good stories later." She laughed again and admitted that was exactly what she did. By the end of the conversation, she told him it was one of the most interesting first interactions she'd had at a social event. What Daniel unknowingly practiced that night has a formal name in psychology: perceptive attunement. It's the ability to notice subtle emotional or behavioral signals and reflect them back to another person in a way that makes them feel recognized. When this happens, the brain releases oxytocin, a hormone associated with trust and bonding. It's the same chemical involved in close friendships, family attachment, and romantic relationships. In other words, making someone feel truly seen isn't just emotionally meaningful, it's biologically bonding. This is why great therapists, great leaders, and naturally charismatic individuals share a common trait. They don't dominate conversations with clever lines or impressive stories. They notice things, and they reflect those observations back to the people around them. Social psychologist Robert Cialdini, known for his research on persuasion, described something called the principle of liking. People are far more likely to trust and connect with individuals who make them feel understood. You seem accelerates that process because it signals perception and empathy almost instantly. But there are a few mistakes people make when trying to apply this idea. The first mistake is treating it like a scripted line. If it sounds rehearsed or forced, people will feel that immediately. Remember those mirror neurons? People subconsciously detect authenticity. The second mistake is focusing only on appearance. Observations about personality, attitude, or perspective are far more engaging than simple compliments. The third mistake is failing to truly listen after the observation. The purpose of you seem is to open a conversational doorway. Once the other person steps through it, the real magic happens when you listen deeply instead of planning your next line. Presence is the real foundation of attraction. At the end of the day, most people move through life feeling largely unseen. They're surrounded by others, yet rarely feel truly noticed or understood. The person who develops the habit of observing, understanding, and reflecting what they see becomes naturally magnetic. Not because of appearance, not because of clever tricks, but because of the experience they create for others. To simple words you seem, but behind them lies an entire philosophy. Be curious about people, pay attention to the details others overlook, and reflect those observations with sincerity. When you do that consistently, you won't just improve your conversations. You'll deepen friendships, strengthen professional relationships, and transform the way people respond to your presence. And once you understand this, you start to realize that real charisma was never about saying the perfect thing. It was always about seeing people clearly and letting them know that you do.